For sure. I mean, this gathering was called to talk about defense, and of course, the subject of Greenland is going to be looming over the summit very heavily. But now, because of the actions against Canada and Mexico over the weekend and Trump's promise that the EU is next in terms of his trade wars, the subject of trade will also be dominating today's summit. Now, we've noticed a distinct change in tone from the EU yesterday. Up until this weekend, the European Commission here behind me has not wanted to really talk about this. And every time they were asked about the prospect of Trump's tariffs, they would say they would have platitudes about how great the EU-US relationship is, that they don't think this would happen because it would be so damaging to the global economy. Well, guess what? It's happening. And so now they have to shift into a different mode here. There was a change in language. You noted that the spokesperson yesterday said that there would be a firm response. That's really an upgrade from the last language we had about this from the European Commission when you had the economy chief Valdis Dombrovskis say any such response, which is so unlikely because this is all very unlikely, would be, quote, proportionate. So clearly this is a break glass moment for that Plan B emergency retaliation plan that the Commission has said all along that they have, but they haven't been willing to talk about what's in it. And so I imagine behind these closed doors today with the European prime ministers and presidents, they will be fleshing out a little bit more what those plans are. We'll see if that is leaked. They certainly don't want it to be leaked because they do not want to escalate this situation. And of course, the nightmare scenario for them would be that if it gets out exactly what they're planning to retaliate with, that's going to instigate Trump into very quickly putting on maximum tariffs against the EU when that might have been avoided otherwise. Now, what might they do? We have a little bit of an indication based on the tariffs that Trump put in during his first term. Now, these tariffs during the first term were much, much less compared to what he's talking about now. That was just 25% on imports of steel and 10% on imports of aluminum. Now we're talking about a blanket tariff on all products. It is a totally different ballgame. However, back then, the EU responded with tariffs on items of Americana, motorcycles, whiskey, blue jeans, things particularly that were made in the heartland of the Republican Party. So that may be what we can expect for a first round. But I think, and all expectations here now, is this is going to be much, much more serious than what we saw during the first term, that this could very quickly escalate into a full-blown trade war. And the IMF has warned, because the EU-US trade makes up such a huge part of the global economy, this could wipe out 7% of GDP for the entire planet Earth. So it's a very serious situation here. Nobody here in Brussels wants to escalate this, but the time for wishful thinking that maybe Trump won't actually follow through on this is clearly over.
David, you said at the top that this meeting initially called anyways to talk about defence and spending on defence alongside NATO.
Yes, exactly. And that's going to be what they come out of the summit with. There won't be any official conclusions at the end of the summit because this was an informal summit called by Antonio Costa, the new European Council chief. What he specifically wants to talk about is EU funding for defense. And the big disagreement is where they should buy that military equipment. French President Emmanuel Macron is insisting that there should be a Buy European clause on this new EU military spending. He does not want to see this money flowing to the United States because if the point of Europe spending more on its defense is to make itself more sovereign and less dependent, if they're buying all of that military equipment from the United States, that doesn't make them any less dependent on the United States. So France's point here is that if the EU is going to do this, and they should, and they need to buy European so they lessen that dependency. But that is running into huge resistance, particularly from the very pro-American Eastern European EU member states. Germany is not so keen on this, particularly because they want to be able to use the Patriot missiles that the U.S. Defense Industrial Complex makes, because that's going to be part of this new plan for an EU shield, missile shield over the European Union. So the key thing to watch here is whether President Macron comes in here with a compromise offer, let's say, with a less sweeping by European plan that he could sign off on, where, for instance, those Patriot missiles could be allowed. We'll see. But what frame. What we're hearing from the French side is they have no intention to back down on this, and it would be a long-term strategic mistake for European countries and the EU particularly, what we're talking about here, money from the EU budget, to be used to deepen Europe's dependence on the United States, particularly given that the President of the United States is threatening a military invasion of the territory of an EU member state at the moment.
Dane, thanks so much. Dave Keating joining us there from Brussels. We're going to stay on the same theme. Those leaders lunching today then with the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte and dining as well with the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer later. The event, the whole event, if you like, is being billed as a retreat devoted to defence rather than a formal summit aimed at open discussions without any official declaration or decisions. NATO leaders, hoping for calm from Trump, have had rather a rude awakening as Trump threatened to annex part of the territory of Denmark, Greenland, of course, Denmark, a NATO ally. They're still scrabbling then for an adequate response. Talk about that with our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons, who joins me now here on set. Rob, just how alarmed do you think, first of all, do you think US allies should be?
Well, you know, the threat over Greenland has really set the cat among the pigeons in Europe, no question about it. And they know Donald Trump from the past. It's not like he's an unknown quantity anymore. They know from his past that he's liable to do unexpected things and to force them through. Dave Keating talking about tariffs last time round. This time round, he's threatening them again, but they're going to be much more severe. Nobody in Europe doubts that he's capable of going down that road. Nobody doubts that he is capable of pushing the United States towards annexation of Greenland, although it's thought pretty unlikely. So, you know, they are taking this really seriously indeed. And the question is, how do you respond to it? Because, after all, the United States remains and will remain Europe's major ally. Which just brings us round to the whole issue of defence, because without the United States, Europe effectively, at this stage at least in its history, doesn't have the defence it needs to protect itself against potential hostility coming from Russia, for instance. So they have a lot of dilemmas to deal with at the same time. And coming under immense pressure from Donald Trump, they are going to have to debate seriously what they do about their defence policy. But Emmanuel Macron has been promoting the idea of European strategic autonomy for quite some time. He will undoubtedly feel that developments over the last 2-3 years, the war in Ukraine, Donald Trump's return to power in Washington, makes his arguments that much stronger. But there are others, you know, within the European Union. This has always been the problem with the European Union. There's 27 sovereign states with different points of view on all kinds of issues. There are others who see things completely differently, as we heard Dave just saying now. You know, the East Europeans, Germany to a degree, the so-called Atlanticists, United Kingdom, who's invited to this meeting today as well, first time since Brexit happened, who want to preserve that relationship with the United States and see, for instance, purchasing US weaponry as a hook to make sure that the United States remains committed to the defence of the European Union. We buy your weapons, you defend us. And there are others who completely reject the idea of a need to boost spending now. You know, the Hungarians, the Slovaks, who have a very cosy relationship with Moscow and don't want to upset that link. So it's going to be, although I think there is a recognition by and large within the European Union that they have to do more to spend on defence, to organise their defence, and indeed are spending more on defence than in the past. There are lots of divisions that are going to make it very difficult to come to any sort of unanimous decision.
You mentioned Ukraine. Of course, that's going to figure largely in the discussions. France has been among those states, as you say, calling for the European Union to develop its own defence capacities. Do you think there will actually be some kind of shift in that direction?
I think there has to be. I think there is a recognition that the European Union has to start developing its own defence capacity. One of the big problems in the supply of Ukraine over the last few years is that the European Union, despite having the will to give weaponry to Ukraine, has simply not had the military industrial capacity to produce the artillery shells, the weapons to back up its promises. And I think the recognition is there now that they have to start doing that. Germany, over the the last year or so and going forward to 2025, committed to spending 100 billion euros on improving its defence. That's a huge shift for Germany. And if it's followed by others, then that would really make a difference to the European Union's defence commitment. There are problems, though, despite the fact that most European members now do spend more than 2% of their GDP on defence. There are countries, major countries in Europe, like Spain and Italy, which are still committing less than 2%, 1.5% of their GDP to defence. Until the European Union can get unanimity on that, it's always going to be a problem. It's always going to make life difficult for it to get a strong position on defence, despite the threats coming from Russia and despite the problems being created for the European Union by Donald Trump.
Rob, thanks very much. Rob Parsons, our Chief Foreign Editor here on France 24.